fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren.
Heard on KCAA 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
And that's the murder of E. Howard Hunt's wife, Watergate's darkest secret. And the author is her son, St. John Hunt. Thank you for taking the time again.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, I was just noticing now, a lot about your mother really hasn't been focused on and come to light. And going through a lot of the literature in the book, I didn't realize that she was so involved. And what was the catalyst that made you write this book?
Well, I think it was a few things that occurred over a span of many years, but certainly immediately after she died, within the first 6 months of her death, Rolling Stone had published an article. And it was an article detailing a Chicago investigator named Sherman Skolnick, who had done a serious investigation into the plane crash, and he claimed it was sabotage and murder. Well, this was pretty hard for me and my sister to take. She'd only been in the ground a few months, and so we wrote a nasty letter to Rolling Stone saying, how could you stoop to this, this yellow journalism and, these accusations which have no truth to them and blah, blah, blah. We were just still very hurt and wounded about her death and lashing out. But they sent a reporter out, Julia Cameron, who eventually married Martin Scorsese. She spent 2 weeks living with Lisa and I at our home in Potomac, Witches Island. So we got a chance to talk about what was going on, and that article was published in a January issue of Rolling Stone with Paul and Linda McCartney on the cover, and the article was called Life Without Father, because he was in prison at the time. It should have been called Life Without Mother, but or Life Without either of them. Yeah. And so that kind of stuck in my head, that whole idea that she could have been murdered, which I didn't believe in at all, until my father in the late 2000s, during the confession sessions that we had in Miami, disclosed that he had always known or felt that she had been murdered, that it was homicide and not the result of pilot error and just a random airplane crash. And he didn't detail anything to me about it, but there was another clue when Charles Colson, when I started Googling it, and I saw this quote of Charles Colson saying to Time magazine that Dorothy Hunt had in fact been murdered by the CIA and FBI. And so I started trying to get a hold of Mr. Colson. This was 2007. My dad had just passed away. And I was able to get a hold of him through his prison ministries. And he substantiated that statement he made that Dorothy Hunt was murdered, but he wouldn't go into details for fear of reprisal. He said, "That's all I'm going to say. I stand by what I said, but I'm not going to go into it for our protection." And that was basically the end of the conversation. He said my dad was a great guy and blah blah blah, and so I thought, there's a whole story. The Bond of Secrecy was published, and I said, there's another half of this whole thing, and that's my mother's story. And as I found out, she had been in OSS, working with OSS people and CIA people, and kept her involvement in covert activities all throughout her life, working basically as a contract agent at embassies in the various host countries that we lived in, Mexico, Montevideo, Uruguay, Japan, Spain, and so forth. And she was apparently quite a skilled and savvy operative. I found out things about her, like in 1944 she was working overtly for the Treasury Department in Bern, Switzerland, under the tutelage of Alan Dulles. Well, Alan Dulles was a name I was familiar with, and I thought, well, that makes sense. And she was working, tracking, and blocking the flow of Nazi assets throughout Europe. And my mother had talks about that when she was alive. On that last summer before her death, we spent many long hours riding horses, and I was able to just hang out with her, and that was where a lot of this information came from. She told me that she was on the last train out of Shanghai when the communists took over, and she'd been stationed in Shanghai to set up the first Treasury Department office there. But of course, she said it was really an OSS CIA safe house, a station there, and and she told me that she was in Switzerland and she worked for Alan Dulles, and apparently the operation that she was part of was called Safe Haven, and that was originally a Treasury Department operation, which then became under the control of the OSS with Alan Dulles. Apparently, there was too much infighting between State Department and Treasury as to how best to track and stop the Nazis from taking their gold and their objects of art and stuff, and then putting them in safe areas in Switzerland. And this was a real operation. When it became under the control of OSS, it became part of their SI branch, which was their secret intelligence branch, and their X2 division, which was counterintelligence. And so my mother, in 1944 in Switzerland, just sort of melted into the OSS from Treasury. And she was just an astonishingly beautiful woman, and very sophisticated looking. She spoke 3 languages at that point, and she was an asset to OSS. And in '46, she was offered a post in China, and in Shanghai, and she opened and established the first Treasury office. As I already mentioned, it was the OSS CIA front also. And her duties were, some of them were as what they call a honeypot, which is to lure low-level or medium-level intelligence operatives of foreign countries like Soviet Union and things like that into compromising positions, which could then be used to blackmail the operative into becoming a double agent and reporting on what was going on in their country, Soviet Union, for example. And she was certainly beautiful enough to have lured any man in any situation. And as I said, she was on the last train out of Shanghai when it fell to the communists, and she had her little .25 automatic pearl-handled gun with her, and it's a gun I saw a few times myself. And in 1949, she was transferred to Paris, and she worked in the office, the Organization of European Economic Cooperation, which was Averell Harriman's operation, and that was to help the restructure and the infrastructure of the war-torn countries in Europe. That's where she met my father, who was Averell Harriman's speechwriter. And they married in 1949. And when my father was stationed in 1950 in Mexico, she continued as an embassy worker in the Mexican embassy, because she spoke fluent Spanish and she was a translator, and she was in all the embassies she worked in. She had available to her documents and cables coming from communist countries that were not that were not able to be accessed by CIA, except for that if they had someone plant in the embassy, and that's what she did. And she continued doing this throughout her life. And then in the early 70s, in 71, she decided she was going to divorce my father. And this is where I heard them arguing and fighting about my father's had promised to her that he was leaving CIA and he would not involve himself in any further intelligence jobs. And then when he wanted to join the Nixon White House to be a part of structuring this secret investigation team for Nixon, my mother, and he argued about it. And she said, you promised Howard. And he goes, I know, but this is an opportunity that I can't pass up. And, they really pumped my dad up. You're going to be working for, Nixon's inner circle and blah, blah, blah. And of course, he thought it was a career move. At the time, he had told her that he was not going to do anything like that. He was going to be a family man, stay around the house and interact with his children, which he had always had a hard time doing because he was always on call for overthrowing governments and things like that. And she went to Europe that summer, and when she returned, she was planning to immediately have him leave our home in Potomac and start divorce proceedings. But instead, the Watergate fiasco had blown up, and I was the only one there to help my father for the first week or so. And when she returned, she took over her responsibility, or what she agreed to do was pick up the cash, which my father had demanded in support of not only our family but of the defendants' families. The 4 Cubans and McCord and Liddy, although McCord didn't want any money, Liddy did, and our family did, and the Cubans needed funding for the attorneys and, the bills, normal bills, mortgage, and so forth. And so she ended up, and I went with her on 1 or 2 occasions to the phone booth in Potomac Village, which was just, 10 minutes from our house, and wait for a phone call. The phone would ring, and she'd pick it up and nod and maybe scribble something down, and then she'd take me back home, and she would then go to the pre-designed location, probably sometimes a Greyhound bus station or an airport facility, and under a phone booth would be taped a key which would correspond to a locker, and she would open up the locker, and there would be a satchel of cash. She brought one home. My father had a place that was he used to stash all this money. It was a place he engineered up in the rafters in the basement. And I knew about it because before my mother came back from Europe, I had met my father under his instructions at the Riggs National Bank in Georgetown in Washington, D.C. And I came one route, and my father had gone there and met me via another route. And he had a safety deposit box there, and he reached in and grabbed a thick manila envelope stuffed with something, and he turned me around, lifted up my sports jacket, and stuffed it down the back of my pants, and then put my jacket over the back of it, and told me to get back to the house in Potomac and keep my eye on the rearview mirror, so that if I was being followed, to try to ditch whoever was following me. So I'm like, well, I don't have any experience doing this kind of stuff, but and I had barely had my license for very long. I was only 17, but I did that, and so she started picking up the money at these locations, and then she'd disperse it to all the defendants, and she was getting really tired of her role as bag woman. She told me that she was being followed, she was being watched. And we already knew that our phones were tapped, but this was a little more dangerous, she felt, because she was in these dark locations alone at night, and she didn't feel that she was safe anymore. She felt things were really coming to a point where my parents' threats to Nixon, they were obviously being taken very seriously, and she, said that there's no way we can win this. And so what she planned to do was take evidence that they had accumulated. My father was really smart to keep evidence against Nixon for a lot of things, for some of the Watergate things and some things that went back to the late 50s and early 60s when Nixon was vice president and approved of this Operation 40 assassination attempts against Castro. Nixon felt that if this were to come out, that he would be impeached. And McCord is on record telling Judge Sirica during his testimony at the Watergate hearings that he knew that Howard Hunt had the goods on Nixon, which would impeach him. And this is apparently what my mother had that she was traveling with to Chicago that night. So, it's the irony and the tragedy of it is that she was finished with my father, that she had reached her absolute limit. He was not a faithful husband, and even beyond his faithlessness, he plunged himself right back into covert work for people that my mother told him and tried to get him to understand were of a lesser moral and ethical background than he was. He said, these people are going to use you and they're going to dump you. If anything goes wrong, these people are not the CIA. They're not going to support you. But she stayed and helped, and that led to, of course, her death.
Yeah. Now, so while you were living, was she practicing as an agent? Was she still part of the CIA and doing things after you were born and you were a child?
Yes, she was a contract agent. In other words, contract agents like Frank Sturgis and my mother weren't on a CIA time clock. They didn't have a record of CIA, but somewhere in a file, hidden and deeply submerged, the handlers of these contract agents would know, who their confidential informants are, or the people that they call their assets. And she was an asset. And so as we traveled throughout the world, she always got work in the embassy of the host country that we were staying in. And in that capacity, she had available to her cables and documents coming from communist countries and so forth that she would be able to take home and copy and then give them to my father if need be. If she wasn't needed to do anything, she functioned as a normal secretary or worker inside the embassy. But if she were requested, to see if she could find any documents, go through the files and see if there's anything that she thought would be that they thought might interest the CIA in terms of a cable that might talk about something relating to the Soviet Union and so forth. That she should use her discretion and copy and supply them to her handler, who was probably my dad. Mm. So yeah, she kept one foot in it.
Oh. Now, so she died on the United Airlines Flight 553, and it was on approach to Midway International. That's in Chicago. So now, you've been referring to her as being murdered, and this was a plane crash, and it killed 43 people. How do you associate it as a murder? What ties you to that now?
Well, it's I'm looking at it from events that occurred immediately after the crash, beyond Charles Colson saying that she was murdered. In support of that, I looked at the events that occurred immediately after the crash. And here's some of the events which were unprecedented at the time. First of all, there was 50 FBI agents that reached the crash site within 40 minutes of the crash. That's something that had never occurred before. Secondly, for 50 FBI agents to arrive at the crash site when the nearest FBI office is only 45 minutes away means that they would have had to have been assembled in various locations and been waiting for something to occur regarding that crash. And I found out that there was a letter written by John Reed of the National Transportation and Safety Board to acting FBI Director William Ruckelshaus. In the letter, John Reed says that that he had taken note that there was many FBI agents had taken a number of non-typical actions relating to the accident, and for the first time in his memory, an FBI agent went to the control tower and confiscated, after listening to it, a tape of the conversation between the tower and the cockpit of the plane. He said, and especially because this plane carried Dorothy Hunt as one of the passengers, he wanted to know, first of all, what jurisdiction the FBI was operating on, and secondly, what on earth was why was the FBI all over this plane crash when it's not their job? It's not their job to ask questions of people. It's not their job to investigate a crash scene. It's not their job to go and confiscate pertinent evidentiary material. And luckily for John Reed, William Ruckelshaus wrote back to him and said, well, in fact, Mr. Reed, the FBI does have investigative jurisdiction in domestic airline crashes only if there's a connection with the destruction of the aircraft or the willful damaging, destroying, or disabling of any civilian aircraft pertaining to aircraft piracy, interference with flight crew members, assault, murder, manslaughter, and attempts to commit murder or manslaughter. So when I read that, I thought, they obviously, the FBI was amassed somewhere, and they thought that something was going to happen on this plane, and then they responded. So, an FBI agent even went to the airport tower, listened to the tape. This was a guy named Special Agent Hartz, and after listening to the tape, he said, I recognize the sound on the tape of being that of the stall indicator of the aircraft. And the control tower persons agreed, that does sound like a stall indicator. And S.A. Hartz immediately notified the FAA headquarters in D.C., and FBI investigation was terminated after 20 hours. Now, thirdly, on the very next day, less than 24 hours after that plane went down, Nixon, for reasons unknown, other than the obvious ones the conclusions I'm arriving at, appointed Eagle Krogh to Undersecretary of Transportation. Eagle Krogh is one of Nixon's inside special counsel in the inner circle. He was my father's superior in the plumbers, the secret White House investigation team that had done so many illegal activities for Nixon. And Nixon appoints him Undersecretary of Transportation, and that position gave him control of the NTSB investigation of that crash. So even a month after that, Nixon appoints Alexander Butterfield, another top Nixon insider and White House member, in the position of administrator of the FAA. So here we have Nixon, putting in two men in key positions to, number one, they would have had access to all the investigation. Number two, they had the ability to control where the investigation was going. And three, they had control over the final outcome of the investigation. Now, just those two things alone really told me that there was something really unusual about this crash, differing from all other crashes. And to me, it looks like there's a cover-up going on here. There's an element that wants to control the investigation and how it comes, the final determination of the NTSB is going to read. And that tells me that it was murder. And certainly years later in the 2000s when my father was talking to me about it, he said that he felt that she was murdered to keep him quiet. And it certainly worked, because less than a week after she died, he pled guilty to all charges and kept his mouth shut.
Well, what do you think? I mean, it's noted that she was carrying $10,000 in cash in $100 bills. But what, other than that money, what was the purpose of killing her? What did she have?
Well, as I said, she had evidence linking Nixon to the Watergate, the whole Watergate fiasco. Not just the break-in, but some of the other things which had been financed by the committee to re-elect the president. And this was in the form of canceled checks that had been laundered through a Mexican bank in the name of Bernard Barker, who was one of the Watergate burglars. This was money coming from Nixon's slush fund at the committee to re-elect the president, which financed the Watergate burglary. It financed the illegal entry into the Chilean embassy. It financed the operation down in Los Angeles, where my father and the team broke into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist office and ransacked his files. It financed the boathouse that they had in Miami, stocked with $1,000 a night hookers and two-way mirrors and film cameras. It financed the eavesdropping devices that had been purchased and used, the tape recordings, the payments for the burglars themselves and all the other people involved. The $10,000 in $100 bills that she was carrying was meant for a gentleman in Chicago who ran he had a very highly respected company known as Stevens Research Labs, and his name was Stevens. And he had handmade some of the recording devices and things like that they used in the Watergate burglary. Now, people thought the $10,000, I don't know, my father said in his book, Undercover, that it was their money and they were taking it to Chicago for safekeeping and to invest in a Holiday Inn. But in reality, the money was going to Stevens Research to pay him off. Now, this guy, Stevens, also, after the crash, within a day or two, received anonymous death threats on the telephone. And he was told, and he testified this, he called the FBI and made an official report. He told the FBI that he had received these death threats on his phone, and that the threats said that he had better keep his mouth shut, otherwise he was going to end up like Dorothy Hunt. So that's just one more piece in the puzzle.
And she was on with Michelle Clark.
Right. Apparently they were going to hold a press conference in Chicago. And my mother was she was finished with it. She did, she said, we're going to end this. We're going to tell everything that we know. And she knew everything. And she was going to blow the lid off the White House. And my father had sent a threat just a few days before the flight, saying in a letter to a Nixon attorney, he said, quote, "The Watergate bugging is only one of a number of highly illegal conspiracies engaged in by one or more of the defendants at the behest of senior White House officials. These as yet undisclosed crimes can be proved." And in James McCord's testimony to the Watergate hearings, he said, quote, "Hunt had information which would impeach the president." So Nixon, you can hear on White House recordings, was deeply concerned about my father, and he ranted and raved about how we had to use any means necessary to keep my father from talking. And John Dean was asked by Nixon, I wonder how much money it would take to continue paying Hunt off. And John Dean, he said he just pulled, in his book, he said he just pulled a figure out of the top of his hat, but he said $1 million. Hunt's probably going to cost us $1 million. And Nixon, without hesitating, said, I can get $1 million. I know where I can get it. I can get it, soon. We have to keep Hunt quiet. He knows too much. If you open up that scab, a lot of things are going to come out, things which will make Hunt look bad, things which will make the CIA look bad, things that will make me look bad. This whole Bay of Pigs thing is going to come out. And he kept referring to this Bay of Pigs thing, which years later in a book by Haldeman, he claimed that the Bay of Pigs thing was a reference to the Kennedy assassination. And although Nixon wasn't primarily involved in the assassination, he did feel that the assassins themselves were the same members of the teams that were part of the Operation 40. Nixon felt horrible about the fact that the possibility existed that some of the same members of a team he agreed to and green-lighted and supported as vice president would then turn around and kill the president of the United States. He felt that this association alone would cause his complete and total the end of his political career. And he did not want that to come out whatsoever. And, of course, the canceled checks that my mother was carrying and so forth, and the fact that Michelle Clark, the first African-American newscaster for CBS, was on that plane, and apparently they were going to have a press conference. So that's why the plane had to come down, because it was at that moment that they realized, well, this news conference is not going to happen. And people ask, well, isn't that a bit unrealistic for whoever, CIA, FBI, or both of them, to kill or bring down an entire plane load of people with all these innocent people just to get one or two people? And the answer, frighteningly enough, is no, it's not unusual. It's a classic CIA method of disposal. In other words, if they just killed my mom to keep my dad quiet, the investigation would be on her death. But if you take a plane out or an apartment complex or whatever to kill one or two people, where's the investigation going to center on? The plane crash, not the specific murder of an individual in the plane, because everybody knows the people that died in the plane crash. So the investigation is going to center around how the plane crashed. And with Nixon controlling, or he had the ability to control the investigation and the final outcome of the NTSB report, it's, you've got to be pretty stupid not to think that there was some kind of involvement to get rid of Dorothy and Michelle Clark.
And from the inside, but from the family, how did your father react, and what do you think that he thought of your mother's death at the time?
I think he knew right away that she was murdered. I think he was very aware that that this was a possibility. And as my mother said to me, this is a no-win situation. We can't win this. And I don't know what, I just think it was really tragic. I know that he must have known right away, because his reaction to it was to plead guilty to all the charges. In other words, he wasn't going to testify. He wasn't going to bring in names. He never mentioned that Nixon was a part of the Watergate break-in, and that he never talked about it after that. He never offered information for clemency. And even though Nixon, told him that, don't worry, he's going to be granted clemency as soon as things cooled off a little while. And after he was reelected, my father expected that he would be granted clemency once the trial was over and he was sentenced. But it never happened.
Do you think he did that for a sense of loyalty for the country, or for just his own set of values?
Did what?
Took the sentence, never talked about Nixon.
He told me that he did that because he feared for the safety and the lives of his children, he told me, which means me and my sisters and my brother. He said at that point, all bets were off. And this was, like my mother said, a war situation that you can't win. You cannot succeed in blackmailing the President of the United States and remove him from power. You're going to be killed. You're going to be silenced one way or another. And I think to kill my father would have been much too obvious. And so the best way, you don't want to necessarily take the man out, but you want to take out what he loves, what he treasures the most. And that's common tactic in the mafia. And then, anytime you want to control somebody, you either kidnap their family or their kids or their wife, and the threat of death is levied, and usually you get to total cooperation from the person that you want cooperation from, and they wanted my dad's cooperation.
So did Nixon ever bring up the subject or talk about your mother's death or the plane crash?
You know, he did. It was interesting. There is a conversation recorded between Charles Colson and Richard Nixon, and let's see if I have it here. In which Colson calls Nixon, I think on December 8th or early December 9th, either the night of the crash or the early morning following the crash, and he tells Nixon that Howard Hunt's wife was just killed in a plane crash, and Nixon is very reserved, and he goes, "Oh, that's tragic. Are they Catholics?" he asks, and Colson goes, "Well, yes, they were Catholics." And Nixon said, "That's very, very tragic." And Colson goes, "Yes, she was the pillar of strength in that family. She was one of the savviest women you could ever meet. Dorothy Hunt, she had everything going on. I mean, she knew the whole thing," is what he says. And Nixon didn't really comment too much on that, other than to say, "Okay, that's tragic." And that could be just Colson calling Nixon and going, "It happened. The plane crashed. She died." And Nixon, all he has to say is, "Oh, I'm sorry about that." And that gives him the information that, if that's the case, this would be a perfect way to tell Nixon that they had that under control. I don't know that that's what it was, but that's certainly more than feasible.
Well, didn't your parents, wouldn't she have met Nixon at one time during all this? So wouldn't he have known her?
Well, let's see. She and my father both met Eisenhower in 1957 down in Montevideo, and I'm not sure if in that line, because they're all kind of in a line in the meeting, shaking hands with Eisenhower. I know my father met Nixon back then and had two occasions to sit with him in the late 50s. And my mother, there's a picture of her and my dad shaking hands with Eisenhower at that time, but there's no photographic evidence that she met Nixon at that time. Although when Nixon was president later on, my father invited us children to attend a White House function where they would be able to meet the president. And so at that time, he and my mother went. I don't know if any of my sisters went, but I didn't go. I was against the war in Vietnam, and my father was upset that I didn't go. But so she would have had opportunity to at least shake his hand.
When your mother was alive, she was still very much part of your kids, your upbringing, right?
Oh, yeah. She was definitely hands-on. I mean, we always had help. I think it was common in those days to have, nannies and servants. We always had a cook and gardeners and nannies and ladies that were in charge of the laundry and a woman that was in charge of the cooking and, all that kind of stuff. I mean, we lived, pretty well in those days. And, so, there was times when, both my parents would be gone, and certainly when they would go out, and they did quite a lot to embassy functions, parties, and social get-togethers, which was part of her duties as a CIA asset, was to feel people out that could possibly be turned as double agents. So we would have a nanny always, that would stay that lived in our house. The cooks lived in our homes, and the nannies lived with us, and so, she was able to go out and about, but she was always our mom, and she was, definitely a hands-on mom there all the time, in retrospect.
Now, if that plane didn't crash, if they weren't successful at bringing it down, how do you think that would have changed things? What would have came next?
Oh, God. If they had that press conference, that would have been Nixon's demise. I mean, he definitely would not have survived that. No way. They had evidence linking his money to financing the operations. And at the time, nobody knew about anything else. They only knew about the 4 or 5 guys that were arrested in the Watergate complex of the Democratic National Committee. And this would have blown everything open. The Chilean embassy break-in, the Ellsberg break-in, my father going to Milwaukee and breaking in Arthur Bremer's apartment, who was the assassin of the near assassin of George Wallace, crippled him, paralyzed him, but didn't kill him, to break into his apartment in Milwaukee and plant pro-McGovern literature. My father had dirt on Teddy Kennedy that Nixon ordered for Chappaquiddick. He was ordered to make up cables, special interdepartment cables, blaming Kennedy directly, giving evidence in the cables, these false cables, in the assassination of Diem, the prime minister in Vietnam. Nixon wanted the image of Kennedy tarnished because he couldn't stand that Kennedy was so revered, when he felt that Kennedy was nothing more than a pampered New England man who never had to work hard, as opposed to Nixon, who did, and who was viciously unfaithful to his wife, and therefore unfaithful to everything that Nixon held, as being morally correct. But there was, a lot of other things that happened on that crash. For example, that plane was ordered to go to O'Hare Airport initially, and at the last few minutes, it was told to go to Midway, which didn't have the modern radar and runway technology that O'Hare did, and so it was also being handled by both towers, and it's called a handoff from O'Hare to Midway. But under oath, the approach controller it said he had forgotten to give 553 approach clearance, and so 553 were led to believe they were in a holding pattern. Midway didn't tell 553 that their plane was too far to the right of Midway's outer markers. And in clear violation of regulations, Midway was working 2 planes for the same runway at the same time. Because Flight 553, this big United flight, found itself with a small two-propeller plane, an aerial commander, directly in front of it, which caused panic in the cockpit for a potential air crash, which caused the big United plane to stall. And at that point, it was already too low of an altitude and too slow, which ended up being why it crashed. And it was so far to the right of the markers anyways, because of these contradictions between the 2 towers were telling the plane 2 different things. So it just seems like, the pilot of United Flight was Wendell Whitehouse. He was United Airlines, just coincidentally, their most decorated pilot. This guy had been on United, an employee of United Airlines for a long time, and he had flown, thousands and thousands of hours in a plane just like that. Never had any problem. And he died, Yeah. But as my father said, in reaction to the Guatemalan deaths that I talked to him about, he said it's just collateral damage,
Yeah. Yeah, need it to be done.
It's horrible to do that, but it goes on in much. I mean, look at what Bush did in Panama. Just to get Noriega out of that country, because Noriega was starting to threaten, what he knew about the CIA drug smuggling operations that were going on, because they used Panama as a midway point between where the cocaine was picked up and then on to Panama to do whatever they were doing there, and then on to the U.S. to Mena, Arkansas. And what did they do to get Noriega to be quiet? Well, they invaded the whole country and caused hundreds of deaths of innocent men, women, and children.
Do you think what happened, the series of killings and even the Watergate break-ins, all the things that happened, JFK, do you think that was kind of a first? And that there was leaders that were learning how to manipulate the system, so to speak, and now it goes on today, and because of it?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I don't think it was the first, because prior to the Guatemalan invasion, there was one more. There was one. The original CIA-controlled coup in a foreign country was in Iran, and when the government in Iran was going to nationalize the oil companies, which were set up by the British, by the way, not American involvement. The British asked the CIA to step in and create a coup, because the British didn't want to get directly involved, and we did. And so, we ousted the leader, and we put in the Shah of Iran, who ran just the worst kind of secret police, Savak, as a matter of fact, detaining hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, torturing them and killing them and executing them and keeping them locked up without any due process. So that was the first one, and then it was Guatemala, and then it was Cuba. But yeah, these were learning processes. The JFK assassination was a learning process. Watergate was a learning process, and you realize that since then, okay, Nixon wanted to cover up the whole Watergate thing by declaring national security. This involves national security, so you can't get into it. I have presidential discretion and hands off. That you just have to believe and trust me. Well, that wasn't allowed to go down. Nixon was not allowed to declare national security. The Democrats went after him anyways. They convened the Watergate hearings and all that stuff, and you can't do that anymore. I mean, when George Bush was subpoenaed to testify about the Iran-Contra stuff, in an interview with CBS, the interview said, "We understand you've been subpoenaed to testify. Are you going to testify?" George Bush, just in that way, he smiles, like he looks like such a dummy. He goes, "I don't testify. No, I don't testify."
Yeah.
The whole Iran-Contra thing, everybody got away with murder. George H.W. Bush got away with all the things he did. His son did. They've learned from all these things that, as you so clearly put, or in the question. Yeah, these were all learning steps.
Yeah, and it's gone to a level where maybe it's so buried that we don't realize it.
And it just, I think even beyond it being buried, I think it's carried out in such openness, without fear of public reprisal. I mean, I don't know how else either of the Bushes got away with everything they did so obviously that they never got impeached, or they never got prosecuted. Oliver North, okay, he went down, but he was their fall guy.
Right. Well, I think that it's really corporate controlled in a way, right? So, corporations that do things wrong aren't being held responsible like CEOs, so at the same point, neither are the leaders, right?
Right. And I think the earliest relationships between corporate America and the intelligence world started occurring when we went into, when the British asked us to go in and depose the religious leader in Iran. That was clearly corporate motivated. Guatemala was clearly corporate motivated, and so it's that wedding happened then and continues to this day.
Yeah. It's a depressing thought. So now, one thing about the title I noticed was you called it Dorothy, and then you say an Amoral and Dangerous Woman. That's quite a statement. What made you put that in the title?
Well, it's interesting. That my publisher asked me, well, why do you want to say that about your mother? And I said, well, I took it from a CIA file declassified under the Freedom of Information Act. Now, I don't take any credit for being the one that had that declassified, but in a CIA memo, Dorothy Wetzel, as was her maiden name, was written about and investigated and written about in a memo, and they described her as a amoral and dangerous individual and I said woman instead of individual. Right. And then it goes on to say, who underhandedly attacked those persons who incurred her enmity. And so that this was a description of her as the CIA depicted her. Wow. And I think it's a compliment. I mean, I put it out there because I think, damn right, she was dangerous, you know. And in the right in the right instances, yeah, she could be amoral. She might not have a conscience about doing something. If you mess with her,
well, it's all relative to the situation, right?
Yeah, it is.
So I just found that to be very interesting. So, what's your overall view of your mother, if you had to say it in a couple of words or a short?
She was the embodiment of love. I felt so much love for her and still do, and she was just a remarkable person, ahead of her time. She should be viewed as a role model for all women, as an independent, fiercely strong, fiercely loyal person, very much in charge of herself at a time when women, you know, had very few roles in intelligence or in most other businesses, as a matter of fact, the late 40s and early 50s. She is someone who was ahead of her time and should be noted as such, a role model for all women of, feminine empowerment. Absolutely.
Amazing. So what's up next for you?
Well, I just I co-wrote a book with Roger Stone, which is available online, and will it be available in stores next week. It's called Jeb and the Bush Crime Family, and that's a co-written Roger Stone St. John Hunt book. And I'm working on a second book with Roger on the JFK Jr. Story, his life and his death. And we've got some amazing things involving his death too that we've uncovered. That we're going to put out.
Oh, I could imagine. And Roger Stone has been on before and writes quite good.
Yeah, his stuff is. I mean, he just goes for the jugular. You know, I mean, it's the Clinton War on Women book that he just published 6 months ago or so. I worked on that book, but didn't get credit for it, and that's fine because it was a test. Roger, you know, after I helped with that book, he asked me to do the Bush book with him and to continue doing books. He likes my writing style a lot, and so we're good friends. He lives in Fort Lauderdale, and I live in Fort Lauderdale, and he doesn't mess around. He goes for the jugular. He says what he feels, and he backs it up with verifiable footnotes.
Well, again, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. I've enjoyed myself. I think you're a wonderful host and a good interviewer, and you've let me ramble on probably long enough.
To find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.